Welcome to today's Explainer. We're diving headfirst into one of the most monumental tasks a man can ever take on, fatherhood. Honestly, being a dad is this incredible mix of beautiful, challenging, and, let's be real, incredibly heavy responsibility. Instead of looking at whatever the latest parenting trend is on social media, we're actually going straight to the ultimate source text. We want to see what true, lasting fatherhood really looks like by looking at some timeless, biblical models. By the end of our time together, you're going to have a clear, visual roadmap of what it actually means to be a foundational figure in your family's life.
But okay, before we get to those models, we've got to acknowledge the elephant in the room. If you're a dad, or if you're about to become one, you've probably stared at your kid at some point, felt this absolute crushing weight of their future, and asked yourself this exact question: who is adequate for these things? It's a completely natural feeling of inadequacy. Actually, the Apostle Paul asked this very same question in 2 Corinthians when he was faced with leading his own spiritual children. I mean, raising an eternal soul? That's impossibly hard. It literally requires 1,000 little miracles that we just can't pull off on our own. But as you'll see, feeling inadequate is actually the perfect place to start.
So, how do we handle it? Well, look at how these massive, daunting jobs break down into 4 clear, actionable roles: the protector, the provider, the teacher, and the example of God's love. These aren't just, modern psychological buzzwords. These categories are deeply rooted right there in the biblical text. And when you break fatherhood down into these 4 specific areas, suddenly the impossible kind of starts to feel practical. So let's jump straight into our first biblical model and see these roles in action.
Section 1. Noah, the faithful protector.
We so often treat Noah's story like this cute little children's tale, but in reality, he was surrounded by a deeply corrupt world that constantly mocked him. Noah's fatherhood wasn't just about the physical mechanics of building a giant wooden boat. It was really about these 3 actionable steps of faith. Step 1, he trusted God's warning about things he literally couldn't even see yet. Step 2, he actively protected his family from the spiritual and physical rot of his generation. And step 3, he prepared the ark through sheer daily obedience. He gathered the materials, loaded the supplies, and just endured the mockery of onlookers who completely thought he'd lost his mind. His protective instinct was fueled 100% by his steadfast faith.
There's this absolutely beautiful lyric from a song about fatherhood that says, "He taught me how to be a man with patient hands and a steady plan." I love that because it perfectly encapsulates Noah's protective nature. Building that ark required incredibly patient hands and a remarkably steady plan, day in and day out over decades. He didn't just protect his family with some sudden, aggressive show of force, right? He protected them with a quiet, enduring, daily foundation built entirely on love, faith, and patience. And because he stuck to that obedience, God saved his family, and through them, repopulated the whole earth.
Section 2. Joseph, the quiet guardian.
Now, the Bible gives us very few direct references to the earthly father of Jesus, but what we do see is a man who embraced massive tension with just absolute integrity. Think about it. Under the law of his day, Joseph could have made Mary's sudden pregnancy a huge public disgrace. He could have even divorced her, but his righteous, compassionate heart planned to protect her reputation secretly, shielding her from all that earthly humiliation. And then, flip that coin over. Look at the staggering divine task he was handed. An angel literally visits him and says to stay with Mary and raise a child that isn't biologically his. He's then told to wake up in the middle of the night, uproot his whole family, and flee to a foreign country, Egypt, just to dodge a murderous king. Incredible. The reality here is that the strongest heroes are so often the quiet ones, the ones who faithfully care for their families every single day. Joseph obeyed God unswervingly. Every single time God gave him an instruction to protect and provide for Jesus and Mary, he just did it. No debates, no questions asked. He showed his love and his absolute obedience through everyday, quiet faithfulness. It's living proof that you really don't need to be loud or front and center to be deeply heroic to your kids.
Section 3. The Prodigal's Dad, Unconditional Love. When we examine the story of the prodigal son, we almost always focus on the rebellious youth squandering his inheritance. But if we shift our perspective to the father, it reveals this profoundly beautiful model. Consider this classic hymn reflecting on the story. The son returns totally broken, fully expecting to just be treated like a hired servant. But the father doesn't stand up on the porch with his arms crossed demanding an apology. The text tells us that while the son was still a long way off, the father felt compassion, and he ran to him. Now you have to understand, in that ancient Middle Eastern culture, it was considered borderline scandalous and undignified for an older, respected man to hike up his robes and sprint down a dirt road. But you know what? He didn't care about his dignity. He only cared about his boy.
This illustrates perfectly how a father must maintain approachable, forgiving affection, loving his kids even despite their absolute worst failures.
And this brings us to a really profound truth, reflecting the Heavenly Father. Pope St. John Paul II once noted that a human father's most challenging mission is to reflect and reveal God's fatherhood. You are to be the face of God the Father that your child cannot physically see, the voice of God they cannot physically hear, and the touch of God they cannot physically feel. Wow, that is an immense calling. When you show compassion, when you provide, when you discipline with love, you are actively giving your children their very first concepts of who God actually is.
Section 4. A father's ultimate legacy. When all is said and done, a father's overarching role is to build something that completely outlasts him. This brilliantly illustrates what mathematicians call a ray. It has a definitive starting point, but extends onward with absolutely no ending point. At 0 years, your child begins. You have roughly 18 years, which is just a tiny foundational blip, where your teaching, your example, and your relational capital are heavily invested. But look at the end of that timeline, 100+ years. That child is an eternal soul who will live somewhere forever. The financial weight of raising a kid is literally nothing compared to the eternal spiritual weight. The time you spend right now, reading to them, tucking them in, showing them grace, you're shaping a legacy that literally stretches into eternity.
Which leaves us with this final, absolutely vital question. What seeds of love are you sowing today? Whether you are a biological father, an adoptive dad, a grandfather, or a mentor, your quiet, steadfast faithfulness is planting seeds that are going to grow long after you're gone. You might feel inadequate at times, but remember, your adequacy comes from God. Take a page from Noah, from Joseph, and from the father of the prodigal. Lean into the monumental, generational impact of your role. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep building that incredible legacy.